which is a program through the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center in Elkins Park, which is designed to further the message and lessons of the Holocaust by direct interaction between students or interested adults and Holocaust survivors. The stories of those who endured the trauma, pain, and suffering of the Holocaust are all unique, and many of you have been exposed to literature that captures some of the voices from this dark time in history. First, through your summer reading books. Our freshmen, many of them read The Boy on the Wooden Box by Leon Lysen, who was the youngest member of Schindler's List. And our sophomores had the option to read The Diary of Anne Frank. And our sophomore students are currently reading Night and Dawn by Ellie Wiesel. The lessons of these works challenge us as members of this vibrant Catholic community to live out the Catholic social teachings and to treat every human life with dignity and respect, because we were made in the image and likeness of God. To share his story with us, I would like to welcome our guest today, Mr. Peter Stern.
Good morning. Thank you. Before I start, I should sort of mention my procedure. I will give my presentation, and then I hope you have a lot of questions. And at what I feel is the end of the questioning, or maybe someone will tell me when we have about 10 minutes to go, I will ask you some questions. My name is Peter Günther Stern. My brother's name is Samuel. Next one. And this is a picture of my family not too long before we were shipped out. But I was born in Nuremberg, Germany, which is on the Danube River, in March of 1936. My brother, Samuel, was born in 1939. The reason I have this Germanic sounding name, and he is named Samuel, is because of the Nuremberg Laws. And these laws were passed in 1935. However, they were not promulgated in full until the fall of 1936 or sometime later. Prior to that, those laws said that Jews could no longer work for the government. Doctors could no longer work in hospitals. Further rules said Jews could no longer own businesses, could no longer employ people who were not Jewish, could not work in the homes of Christians. Everything had changed. And one of the other statements of those laws were that all Jews born, once these laws were known, had to have Jewish names. These were names that came out of the first book of the Bible: Samuel, Ruth, Esther, Abraham, Moses, and all Jews had to use the middle name of Israel. Now, the reason they didn't publish this right away is they didn't want bad publicity for the Olympics, which were in Berlin in 1936. They were afraid countries like the US might have pulled out. Seems a little bit familiar now. The laws, as I said, prevented people from working in what they were doing. My father was an auto mechanic and electrician. He had his own business, which he had to sell. He then went into teaching at a Jewish school, and I think we have a picture of that. I will get to that one in just a second. Let's go to there we go, where he taught young boys, young men, things about auto mechanics, shop work, and so on, in the anticipation that when they were able to emigrate to another country, they would have a trade. They could not have gone to school for anything else. One of the other things that happened in Nuremberg, and if you would go back one, see the group of kids, all Jews had to live in what was called Jew houses. And there were about 53 of them, I believe, in Nuremberg. This was not a ghetto. They were not all together. They were all over the city. And in the house that we lived in, there were about 3 to 4 families. I can't tell you the exact number, because when you are as small as I was, and I'm the guy on the right of the girl on the tricycle, memories are fungible, and certainly time is very fungible. This was a picture of a party, which I got off the internet because someone wrote about their family, which included that other boy on the other side of the tricycle. At any rate, we all lived in this one house. There was one kitchen, and we all had various rooms for our families. In November of 1941, we were ordered to be shipped out of Nuremberg. You have to remember that this is now 2 years into the war. The war started in September 1939. This is November 1941. And Germany had conquered a great amount of land. So why don't we look at a map? Okay, this is the first map, and this is Europe pretty much as we can see it. And you can see there on the red dot, that's where Nuremberg is. And we were then shipped up to Riga. And we went by train, which the people who were being shipped out had to pay for. And it was packed, but compared to other transportation, which I'll talk about later, this was a very comfortable way, certainly for a small kid to go along. November 1941 was very cold, and we were shipped to a place called Jungfernhof, which is right outside of Riga. It was basically some shacks in a field on which had been somebody's property. And this was up in there. And if you see up there, you also see the word Rumbula. Rumbula was also right out, was a forest outside of Riga. And before this train arrived, a day before we arrived, the Germans had started the execution of over 20,000 Jews which had been in the ghetto. They were mostly Lithuanian and Latvian Jews. There was a group of about 1,000 German Jewish Jews, which were also killed there. We, however, were put into Jungfernhof and stayed there for a week, 2 weeks. I don't remember. I have some memory of the place, but relatively little. If you also notice on this map, there are skulls and crossbones all over the place, mostly in Poland. And the black crosses are at places which were concentration camps designed for killing. These are places like Auschwitz, Sobibor, Belzec. The red skull and crossbones are for places where large slaughters took place. Just like, excuse me, I have it reversed. Rambula, the black ones. The red ones are the concentration camps which were designed for killing. Killing went on in all of them. However, most of them were supposedly work camps, and I'll talk more about that later. For whatever reason, we were taken away from Jungfernhof, and I should mention two survival aspects. Jungfernhof, I believe, had over 5,000 people go through that place, of which 180 people survived. The transport which went up to Riga, which we were part of, and it had over 1,000 people on it, of which 520 came from Nuremberg. And of those 520, there were 17 survivors. My brother, mother, and I were part of that 17 people. All others died. We were taken from Jungfernhof, and I don't remember that. Couldn't have been a long trip. I assume it was by truck, and we were put into the ghetto. And we were put into small rooms in an apartment, small apartment house in the ghetto. And it was near the edge of the ghetto because I could look out the window and see people being taken out of the ghetto on trucks. And I knew this was not a good thing. And I don't know why I knew that. But even at that young age, I knew that. We were in the ghetto, as I said, for an indeterminate amount of time. And in my notes, I have all kinds of question marks about that time, but it probably towards the late or earlier spring of 1942. And then sometime in that spring of 42, we're taken out of the ghetto and put into a larger apartment house, which was part of sort of an apartment house complex where a lot of German officers seemed to have been billeted. We were all in one building, and every morning my father would get the boys from the ghetto, I believe, and would go with them to work on German military vehicles. The people who were in the house, my mother included, were sorting clothing, the clothing that had been taken from the people who had been killed, and they would sort it into men's, women's, children's, winter, summer, whatever categories there were, and the clothing was then sent to Germany. We were in that house, again, as I say, for some time, and probably in the late spring or early summer, we were taken to the garage where the cars were being fixed. And the boys were also living in that area. And my mother did the cooking for those boys, but they worked on the cars there. Again, we had it relatively easy compared to other people because, as I said, my mother cooked for these people, the boys. I played with one of the German officers' kids, as did my brother, the man who was in charge of this facility. But this did not last that long. We went to Russia sometime, and here we are, and to, again, work on the cars, to be closer to the front where the cars were being wrecked. And this was a place where there were no fences. And certainly I don't remember any guards as such. There were German soldiers, but they more or less used my brother and me as reminders of home, played with us. I don't know if they spoiled us, but certainly, as I said, they played with us. I remember being very upset when one of those soldiers, who obviously I thought of as a friend, had been shot up the night before because there were constant guerrilla activities. These forces would basically on a nightly basis, according to my mother, would have gunfire. I woke up once to machine gun fire, yet my mother told my brother and me that this was a nightly event. But he and I slept through it. We were there till, again, sometimes in 1943. And at this point, we were taken away from this and sent back to Riga. And I'll talk about that in just a second. And I should say why. By the end of 1942, the reality was that Germany had lost the war, but nobody knew it. The Battle of Stalingrad was such a tremendous loss for Germany that they no longer were launching any battles or attacks that would take over large areas of land, and the Soviet forces were pushing them back. The boys were sent back to what had been the successor of the Riga ghetto, because it was closed and most of them died. The little bit my mother wrote said that they were all designated to be killed, but there were some survivors. My family was put into a unique place, and that was the men's civil prison in Riga. Nothing to do with the ghetto. And we were in one cell on the second or third floor of that prison. My mother never left that cell. My brother, father, and I would occasionally be allowed to walk in the prison yard. Now, the question is, why was it that we were put there? And what had happened while we were in Russia and fixing cars, my father and perhaps some of the boys were taken to a city that the Germans occupied, where there had been a electrical appliance, generator, transformer, I don't know. And they worked on that. While there was an attack by guerrillas or Soviet forces. And my father saved the life of a powerful German officer. I do not know his name. I only know that this is what our mother told us. And because of that, we were put into that cell in Riga. After the war, our mother told my brother and me that my father and she, had been offered to be Aryanized, that they could stop being Jews if they were to give up my brother and me, which they didn't. At any rate, we were in that cell for about 3 months. And I assume the pressures of the Germans coming towards Latvia and so on were such that they were going to empty everything out. And I certainly wasn't aware of that, but all of a sudden we were moved to another cell in either the basement or the first floor of that prison. And my parents did not know what was going to be happening. And this was the first time I was aware that they were scared. I'm sure they were scared many times before that, but I wasn't aware of it. They, as we, were quite surprised when we were taken out of that cell and put on some army trucks. These were not large trucks. They were sort of like bigger than a pickup truck, but of that nature. And those trucks were filled with clothing that was being brought back to Germany. So we went by truck from Riga to Germany. Took some days. And I think we went to Berlin, but I have no knowledge of that. Every time we came to a border crossing or where there was a guard post, we had to hide underneath all that clothing. And when we came to that city in Germany, I remember driving around because they were looking for either a particular officer or an officer in charge. And those soldiers, which had been who had smuggled us back, gave us up to, I believe, the authorities, and we were put in front of a civil court. And I remember the judge yelling at us, my parents, and the family was separated. My father was sent to Buchenwald, which is one of the first concentration camps that was developed by the Nazis when they came to power. And this is where he died. The rest of us went to a place called Ravensbrück, which has this green triangle right there, which was the only almost exclusively women's concentration camp. This was established in 1938. This was a camp which, when we got there, must have been about 20% Jewish. The rest of the people, women, and you can tell by their uniform, or not by the uniform, by the badge they wore on the uniform, why they were there. So I think a red circle designated politics, pink triangle said homosexuality, yellow star was Jewish, a black or purple circle was a gypsy or criminal. It was one or the other. And I'll talk about the gypsies in a little bit. There were signs for Jehovah's Witnesses and various other things. The women there worked in various things. My mother worked as a field hand. They would be marched, all of the women would be marched out to their various working places in the morning. Some of the factories were attached to the camp. So Siemens, which still is, I believe it is the second largest electronic company in the world, had facilities there. The women would work on making all kinds of different things. Another thing that was very big there, aside from the farming and this factory, was working in the clothing. A lot of uniforms were made around there, and the women had to work on that. Some of the older women who seemingly couldn't work outside anymore or stand all day, which is what they had to do, would be knitting in the camp, because the children, we were in the camp all day, unsupervised for the most part. I should also say that the clothing that they worked on for making uniforms, the fur coats that came from all these places, the camps where people had been killed, would be made into officers, lining for officers' coats, which is one of the more ironic things that happened. We were there for about a year, end of 1943, beginning 1944, till February 1945. One thing that I should mention or re-mention is that the Soviets were coming from the east and the Germans were emptying their concentration camps on the way. Many of the camps were emptied, so people were put on death marches. They were literally walked till they died and put into camps in Germany. So the camp, which were from Poland and so on, which were mostly Jewish, now brought the Jewish population percentage up in Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück, not only did they do the works and so on, was also a place for medical experiments. And many, if not most of the women that were experimented on were gypsies, the Roma. They are the forgotten people of this Holocaust because they lost a tremendous number of their population to the killings and experiments that they did. The experiments they did was they would wound people and try medications to see how they could treat various things. They did a lot of experiments on sterilization. So many of these people, young girls, were sterilized without their knowing. But the Germans, were losing, and therefore this place was also emptied. And we were put in February on cattle car and went from Ravensbrück to Bergen-Belsen, which doesn't look like that large a trip, but it took quite a few days because, and I don't know how many, but I remember we would stand somewhere, the train would stop and people would be there holding there for who knows what reasons. It was cold and hot because we were packed in. We didn't have any food and water to my knowledge. There were only a few holes in the floor where people could relieve themselves. The smell was horrendous. And I should mention the fact that any of the rescuers, the soldiers that freed the camps, knew they were coming onto a camp before they saw it. Because any one of them, if you read any of their memoirs or listen to their talks, will talk about the odor that hit them. And you have to think about the fact these places had very little cleaning facilities. People and the place stank. We were put into Bergen-Belsen, and the conditions, as bad as they had become in Ravensbrück, were still better than what they were in Bergen-Belsen. And it is my belief that we were put into what was, quote, the children's section of Bergen-Belsen, and which wasn't quite as bad as some of the other places, but it was horrendous. By the way, we got to Bergen-Belsen, I think 2 weeks after Anne Frank died there. When the British came, which was in April 15th of 1945, which I consider my second birthday, we were quite surprised. And the next day, the English made a film, which I don't remember, but nonetheless, it was used in the Nuremberg trials, and then it was lost in the Imperial War Museum and found about 40 years later and shown on Frontline. And we watched it. And for a few seconds, I have that little red spot there, and my kid brother were there. I didn't see this right away because it was only a few seconds, but my son and my wife said, "That's you," and I believe it certainly is. You can see the condition of the kids varies by quite a bit. And part of that is because some of us went through different camps. Many of the kids, and this woman in particular, she's in charge of quite a few of these kids, had been shipped from the Netherlands because the Americans and English were also squeezing the Germans, and they were emptying out the concentration camps that they had there. And so these kids were in better condition than we were. But neither here nor there, we were rescued. After the rescue, the British had to burn down the camp because typhoid was rampaging all over the place. By the way, that is what supposedly killed my father in Buchenwald, was typhoid. We were put into, so they could burn down the camp. They took us and put us into various locations in and around the camp. And we were put into what had been a training camp for tanks of the German army. So we were put into the barracks. At this point, my mother had a nervous breakdown, and we were taken out of the general barracks and put what looks, my knowledge is now pretty much officers training place. And we were there till the fall of 1945. At that point, we were taken by truck, American truck, and transported to Nuremberg. By the way, the Bergen-Belsen was freed by the British Army. Freedom wasn't quite enough to save all the people, because the statement, killing by kindness, did occur in all the camps, in that the soldiers were so shook up by what they saw, they gave their field rations to the prisoners. And the field rations were high in fat and concentrated things, and our bodies had difficulty taking this. The Russians, after the beginning of liberating camps, made it, the soldiers had orders not to feed the prisoners, and they were fed cereals and slowly brought back to health. We got back to Nuremberg in 1945, and we were put into what had been an old age home in Nuremberg before the war. And I remember it wasn't too far from that house that we lived in, having gone to this building and riding in the dumbwaiter from the kitchen to the dining room. And this is where the survivors of the camp from Nuremberg were. And what you're looking at now is probably one of the most unusual pictures of the whole Holocaust experience. You see in this picture 2 children and a lot of old people. And these were the people who were killed first when they got to a concentration camp. Yet here we are. I've told you my survival story. These older people were all from a camp. By the way, before we go on, I should point out some of the younger people. My mother, this man who will turn out to be my stepfather and who survived the war, not in a concentration camp, but in the Soviet army. And this guy who was a child before he was put into the concentration camp with his parents. And the concentration camp they were in was Theresienstadt, which was in Czechoslovakia. There it is, okay. And it was the show camp that the Nazis used to show the International Red Cross how really nice a place it was to be in a concentration camp. So every time the Red Cross would show up, they would issue blankets. They would point out that there was an orchestra. They made it seem like a very good place. People there were shipped to places like Auschwitz, and there were some deaths there as well. But it is the only other place where I have met 2 other children who survived. And by children, I mean, we went into the camps as children and we came out as children. If you went into a concentration camp and you were 12, 13 years old and looked mature for your age, you possibly could have survived if you could work, as this guy did. These people, for the most part, were chosen for this camp because they were heroes of World War I. My maternal grandfather died there, as did my maternal grandmother, and he was a hero of World War I. This guy and this guy both were amputees wounded in the trenches. So these were the widows and the survivors of Theresienstadt. We were in this place for about a year. I tried going to school and couldn't. I was something of an emotional wreck. From here, we went to 2 different displaced persons camps. And we, excuse me, we were shipped out of Bremerhaven, which is one of the ports in Germany, on January 7th, 1947, and landed in New York on January 27th. It took 20 days because the ship had to anchor near the English Channel because the storms that winter were horrendous. We landed in New York, as I said. I had to spend a little time on Ellis Island because they didn't know whether my health was good enough to come to the United States. From there, well, I should mention, we were met in New York by 2 of my uncles, my mother's brothers, one of whom had come to the United States in 1933 when he was 17 years or 18 years old, had been in the Army and was living in Florida, because from 1933 until he went into the Army, he had lived in Georgia and Florida. My other uncle escaped from Germany, and I also remember him from 1939 because on the day before Germany declared war, he legally had emigrated to England. However, because he was a German speaker and the English didn't know who to trust, he was put into a detention camp and sometimes later was shipped to Canada with all the other people like him who were German speakers and the English didn't know. And the Canadians, in I believe early 1944, realized that he was not a danger and he wasn't a German in the sense that of the Germans that they were fighting, and he was released. At any rate, we met them there. However, the question was what was become of us. The relative that my mother had in Atlanta who had promised to take us in, somehow that did not come through. So I went with my uncle to Florida. My brother went with a cousin of my mother's to Queens, New York. And my mother worked as a live-in maid in New York. So what hadn't happened during the war did happen here. We were separated. When I got to Florida, it was a very strange experience. One, the weather was like nothing that I had ever imagined. The only things that were familiar to me were the Shell gasoline signs. Shell is an international company and the sign has always been the same. And the way Black Americans were treated. This was quite familiar to me. When I got there in Florida, I was put into the 5th grade, and I could not do that work. I didn't speak English. And I was put back into the 2nd grade. I finished that semester, a school semester in May, and went back to New York. In New York, my mother got an apartment on 23rd Street, and I started school again in the fall in the 3rd grade. Halfway through that, I skipped into the 5th grade. At the end of 5th grade, I skipped into 7th grade, and according to the school records, I was caught up. However, I still believe I had never caught up, and I certainly was not a productive student. So at the end of 8th grade, going into high school, I went to a vocational high school because no one believed, including myself, that I could do the academic work. In vocational high school, I learned to be a refrigeration mechanic, which is a trade I never worked in. At the end of high school, I was able to go to a junior college, which took me 2.5 years to finish a 2-year course. At the end of that, I got a job working in the Brooklyn Navy Yard as a technician, mechanical technician. At the end of that year, I got admitted to the Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy and graduated as an engineer. I went to work for 10 years, and during that 10-year time span, time to change classes, I guess. I went to work for 10 years as an engineer and got married. I have 2 sons. After 10 years, I switched my profession and went into science teaching and did that for 30 years, quite happily. Now, I have skimmed a lot of things because I would like you people to have a chance to ask questions. And how much time do we have left? Hello?
Hi, yes, we have just under 30 minutes
Okay.
left in our period. So a number of students have asked me during the presentation where Mr. Stern lives. And Mr. Stern, I believe you live in Haverford?
I live in Haverford now.
Okay, so not far from here. We're in Drexel Hill at Bonner and Prendie, so not too far. So this is someone who lives literally in our neighborhoods and who experienced so much in his young life while he was a child. So this is an opportunity, really a once in a lifetime opportunity for you to ask any questions you might have. So I'll give those in the audience a chance to think about their question, raise their hand, and then those tuning in through Zoom as well can add any questions in the chat. Mr. Stern, when did you move to the United States? I'm sorry, to Haverford was the question.
Oh, I retired from teaching in the year 2000, and we lived in Newtown, Connecticut for almost 50 years. But my sons, both of them, went to Haverford College, and one of them stayed in the area. And I am now of an age where we thought about the fact that it didn't make sense for our children to come visit us whenever we needed it, so we came to them.
Very nice. So we have a question from Ron, who's one of our ninth graders. He's asking if any of the people, your friends and family who you were in concentration camps with, if they have any sort of post-traumatic stress or PTSD.
I think we all do. I don't think anyone who goes through the trauma, and it doesn't have to be a concentration camp, any trauma will have some carryover for the rest of their life. The real thing is, how well can we live with it?
We have a question from one of our classrooms upstairs on Zoom. Have you ever been back to Poland or Germany?
We, in 2011, the city of Nuremberg invited my brother and me back for a few days to celebrate the date of them kicking us out the first time. So it was November of 2011 that made it 70 years.
And both of my literature classes saw the episode of the Oprah Winfrey Show where Ellie Wiesel gave Oprah a tour of Auschwitz, and that had been 60 years since he had been back. So we saw 60 years with Ellie Wiesel, and who also was assigned to Buchenwald, and 70 years for Mr. Stern. So definitely something to think about how long it took to go back. Yes. Dominic, one of our 10th graders, asked, what was it like being so young to grow up in a time like that?
Well, in a little bit that I've written, I make the point that I think I was old before I was a child. We were aware, the children there, we were aware what could happen, what was happening. One of my memories is that one of the gypsy women in the camp was doing fortune telling with some of the women, and she read my palm and said I was going to have a long life. And everyone, including me, laughed because this did not seem like a very great possibility.
So even as a child, you knew that that was a reality you were facing.
Well, when their guns pointed at you, you know that you're not on the good end.
You had your hand raised? Okay. All right, Giovanni. New World isn't like post-Holocaust life, or New World isn't coming to the United States? So Giovanni, another one of our 10th graders, asked, what was it like adjusting to your new surroundings in the United States after the war?
In Florida, it was, as I said, a very jarring and unique situation, partially because everybody else was speaking the wrong language. So it took a little while, and I'm saying a little while because I think by the time I left Florida, I was dreaming in English. It took some time. In New York, in the vocational high school I went to, which was small and kids were from all over the city, it was, I adjusted I think rather quickly. The other thing is my parents, my stepfather and my mother, they decided that the language we would speak at home would be English, not German. So it was a sort of forced situation. nor did we live in a ghetto situation. We did not live in a neighborhood that was predominantly anything. It was always mixed neighborhoods.
Back in Europe? Have you ever been back to your childhood house that you grew up in?
It was bombed to smithereens. Nuremberg was one of the most bombed cities in the war.
His son? His children? How old are your children now, Mr. Stern?
I have two sons. One, the oldest one, will be turning 52 this January, or this end of December. And the other guy will be 47, and he lives in California.
Charles, one of our 10th graders, asked if you have any flashbacks from your time in the camps or the ghettos.
Not flashbacks, but because I do these talks, and I didn't start speaking until, after I retired, I have the constant memory of what happened. And every once in a while, I think of something and we start to deal with that. Let me just add one thing, and then I'm going to ask your students some questions. We discovered, because my nephew, my son, my brother's son, he had one son, was trying to get some research in Germany about our family. And we found a woman whose mother had been given up to adoption in 1941 and had been raised Catholic and grew up in Germany and is still living in Germany and working in the news industry. Okay, let me ask you the question that I ask all the students. Now, I would be handling it differently if I were in front of you, the ability to point my hands up. I would like you to think about, why do we, the survivors, speak to you? What do we want? What is it that we want to get from you?
Dominic? So Dominic, one of our 10th graders, said so that we as students can have an understanding of what happened in the past and what you went through.
All right, now let me say something else. I will not say or jump up and down and saying, yes, that's it, or anything like that. You are not going to get a grade for this, but I will ask you to ask the question again and again. If somebody else has already said what you're thinking of, don't say it. But I want as many reasons as you can come up with.
Okay, Gio. So Giovanni's observation is that with all the stories that we've read and heard, that no one walked away from their faith or their belief in God. Mary? Okay, to avoid the repetition of something like the Holocaust again. That was from Mary, one of our ninth graders. From our classroom upstairs, that this will not happen ever again. Couple other reasons. Why do speakers like Mr. Stern come into schools to talk about his experience and to relive that experience with you? Okay, from Kai, one of our ninth graders, so that we can learn about it from a first person point of view. Okay, from Matthew, one of our ninth graders, to take what you spoke about and to pass that on to others. Okay, from Anthony, one of our 10th graders, so we can learn about what really happened. Mary. Okay, so the truth can't be twisted or altered as time goes on. Lillian. Okay, so history doesn't repeat. Any others? Yes, CJ? One reason why people like Mr. Stern speak about their experiences. All right, and we have one more. This is from a class downstairs. He's a piece of live history that we see and hear in our school books. So things that we read about or see pictures in books and textbooks, we're actually seeing in person.
Okay. All of these things have some truth to it, but if you were in my class, I would send you back and ask you to do a little more thinking, which I'm going to do. But I want to comment a little bit about what has been said. One, within the Jewish tradition, there is a belief that we all die twice. Once when our bodies no longer function, and the second time when there is no one left to remember us. All the people who died during this war deserve to be remembered. Now I'd like to talk about so history doesn't repeat itself. Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. All of you gave responses which were passive. What is it that you can do to prevent something like this from happening again? Passivity does not work. So, given that hint, what is it that you need to do? You should all be rushing up to the front trying to answer this.
I'm sorry, Mr. Stern, you cut out briefly with our audio. Could you repeat the question?
The question is, what is it that you can do to prevent something like this from happening?
Okay, from Aiden, one of our 10th graders, to spread your message with others.
All right, what else?
From downstairs, from Mrs. Esquivel's class, by raising awareness and reminding people. Oh, I love this. This is from Dominic, one of our 10th graders, by spreading love and positivity to everyone.
Okay.
Okay, from Matthew, to rise up against any conflicts that might arise. To make everyone feel equal. Any others? What are some simple things you were called to do as members of this Catholic school community? Easy things you can do every single day. Okay, this is from Deontay and one of our 9th graders, to pray. From our class downstairs on Zoom, to love unconditionally. Oh, from Samari, one of our 9th graders, to practice what we preach. Okay, from Lillian, to spread the word of God and to live out gospel values.
Okay, I don't know how much time we have left.
We have about 14 minutes until the bell rings.
Oh, okay, so we have plenty of time. I would like to say that based on what you have said, that idea of love is the most important one, but love can't be silent. You have to do it. And sometimes that can be a little painful. I'd sort of like to quote Martin Luther King, who said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." In other words, you have to speak up. And speaking up is a very, very important thing.
Okay. And we had 2 additions from another classroom upstairs. One thing we can do is to care for and love each other. And then from our class downstairs, love is all religions, race, color, and creeds. Any final thoughts? Mr. Stern, would you mind taking another question or 2 from the audience?
Oh, no, I was going to suggest that.
Yeah, Wesley. So the question is it hard to, was it hard to speak to us today or get in front of a group of students and talk about your experiences?
It is always something of an emotional situation. Certainly it's no longer as hard as it was. One of the things that I should mention, I did not start speaking until after I stopped teaching. My students never knew my background. Part of that was because I said I was their science teacher, not their history lesson. But the other part was it took that long for me to get the strength to say, this is something that has to be done. Because as some of you pointed out, unless you know, it doesn't really make any sense at all, unless you've been told.
And our sophomore students just finished reading Night by Ellie Wiesel. And remember, it had been 10 years from liberation to when Night was published. So for 10 years, he couldn't find the words or didn't want to speak out. He wasn't ready to do so yet. And then Ellie Wiesel spent the rest of his life writing nearly 50 books, speaking to different groups and appearing on different networks and mediums in order to spread awareness and to keep that conversation going. Do you have any grandchildren? This is from Ron, one of our 9th graders.
I have 3 grandchildren. One of them she is a graduate student at the Southern Methodist in art history. One of them is a music education major at Temple, and one of them is in high school, a high school senior.
This is from Harold, one of our 9th graders. Where did you teach?
In Connecticut, in a town called Weston.
And you were a high school teacher?
I did high school and middle school, mostly middle school, preferred grounds.
What's that? He, a retired teacher, yes. He was a high school science teacher. Some of our students want you to come to our school and teach.
The thing about teaching is any teacher I know misses it terribly.
Okay, this is from one of our classes downstairs. What is your your fondest memory from your childhood?
I don't know. I've never really had that question asked before. I guess the joy of being with friends and being lost in it, being lost in whatever that joy was. Not having to think about things, because once you were in the camps, you were always thinking about it.
The question that I personally have, and I shared this with some of our faculty members and to our students, is that Mr. Stern, your father was assigned to the same camp, Buchenwald, that Ellie Wiesel and his father were in at the end of the Holocaust. And you and your family were in Bergen-Belsen, which is where Anne Frank was. Now, clearly, with so many people there in different times and people from all over Europe, you wouldn't have known then who those people were. But does it hit you in any way years later as you read different works by Holocaust survivors and victims that you were in some of those places or share things in common with some of the most prominent voices from that time?
I think about it quite a bit. I met Ellie Wiesel because he had a teaching job at Boston University, and my brother was on the faculty at Boston University. He was a biologist, and Ellie Wiesel was speaking one evening, and I was on a field trip with my 7th graders, and I sat next to him before he spoke.
From one of our classes downstairs, what do you think what do you think your greatest accomplishment is?
Having a family which seems to spread some of that love.
Yes, so Claire, yes, so Mr. Stern did meet Ellie Wiesel because remember, Ellie Wiesel became a professor. And so Mr. Stern's brother was on the faculty at Boston University. and he was taking his students on a field trip and got to meet Ellie Wiesel there. Wesley said that's amazing.
My life and everyone who has survived, we have many places where we intersected, and it doesn't just have to be with people who survived.
And for us, the purpose of having this presentation today, the purpose of having summer reading books about the Holocaust, the reason why we read Night and Dawn in ELA II, the reason why we're spending time exploring Holocaust education is because rather than learning through a textbook with a quick paragraph blurb and pictures and a caption, we're actually learning through voices of those who were here, first person accounts. That's what true learning is, hearing directly from people who were there and can speak about their experiences in a much deeper way than any book could cover. Now, we all know that every story that we've either read or talked about in school or at home or in the world is unique. Anne Frank's experience in the annex was very different than Ellie Wiesel's experience in Auschwitz and Birkenau and Buchenwald, and very different and unique compared to Mr. Stern's story. But that doesn't diminish what happened, the pain and trauma of what happened, or what those individuals did afterwards to spread awareness, to discuss, to educate, to teach. Even though Anne Frank was one of the victims of the Holocaust, her diary, which was published after her death by her father, became one of the most famous works of literature, not just of the Holocaust, I would say even in literature. It's something that many students read. How many have read the diary of Anne Frank, either here at Bonn or Prendie or in elementary school? Okay, almost every hand in the room is raised. What about Night by Ellie Wiesel? All my sophomores have their hands raised, and a good number of freshmen have read it in middle school. So these are stories, memoirs, personal accounts that transcend time, and something that we should all commit ourselves to, so that hopefully today we can take away that message of love that we got from this presentation and that we teach here at Bonner and Prendie every day, so that we can prevent something like this from happening. And it takes just one person to make a positive change in the world. Mr. Stern, any final thoughts from you?
You have expressed it very, very well, and I thank you for that.
Oh God, applaud for him, not me, please. I hope you heard the applause. I hope you heard the applause for you.
No, teaching, what can I say? To be able to give people an insight into life is the joy of teaching. And hopefully today will be something that you, the students there, can take with you.
And Mrs. Esquivel shared really one of the main gospel teachings: do unto others as you want them do unto you.
It's as simple as that. And complex.
Absolutely. Last question, Mr. Stern, do you miss the classroom at all?
Oh, yes. Very much.
It's really a gift to be able to work with students every day, I feel.
My wife she taught college for most of her life. But I think that's our one statement. If we had our druthers, we'd still go in one class a day.
Very nice. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Stern, for being here today. We hope you had a blessed Hanukkah. May God bless you. Thank you. And
thank you.